Okay, good morning, everyone. Today we are going to be taking up H91 all day. And we have a lot of witnesses to hear from today. So we're going to get started with Frank Kanak, who is the Executive Director of the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont. And the floor is yours, Frank. I think you've been here and been introduced to all of us. So why don't you take it away? And folks, we do have information from Frank on our website.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Chair Wood, members of the committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. Just to give a little bit of background, so my name is Frank Kanak. I'm with the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont. For those not familiar with HHAV, we are the result of a merger between the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition and the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness. Those organizations had been working in Vermont, as many of you know, for many years. And obviously had coordinated closely together, in part because one of the main solutions to the homelessness crisis is permanently affordable housing and building more permanently affordable housing. And 2 years ago or 2 summers ago, the organizations came together and became HHAV. And at HHAV, we wear two hats. And so one of our hats is, me being here today is advocacy and education. And so we work at the legislature, we work on federal policy, we work on local policy. We educate community members around the problems and the solutions to our housing and homelessness crisis. The second hat we wear is we are the collaborative applicant for the Balance of State Continuum of Care. And for those not familiar with Continuum of Care or COCs, each state has one or more HUD mandated COC that really serves as the homelessness response system for that jurisdiction. And so in Vermont, we have two COCs. We have the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance, which is the COC for Chittenden County. And then we have what's called the Balance of State Continuum of Care, which is the continuum of care for all the additional counties in Vermont outside of Chittenden. And Balance of State is it's a HUD term. It's not a term that we came up with. That's just the term that references the remainder of the state that is not included in whatever specific jurisdictional COC exists.
And Frank, will you say again what HHAV's role is in that?
So we are the collaborative applicant. So functionally, we staff the COC, the Balance of State COC. So we support the work of the COC. We coordinate meetings. We, coordinate across the various jurisdictions. Each of the regions has a local housing coalition, and we support those local housing coalitions. And then we also coordinate across the COC. So we work closely with the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance to kind of understand what a global or statewide solution could look like and should look like, and coordinate that work with CCHA as well.
So does that mean the resources from HUD come through HHAV?
We get what's called a planning grant, and so that enables us to provide the staffing resources. But other than that, the resources in terms of like direct financial assistance that HUD provides to folks on the ground in Vermont, that doesn't come through HHAV. But we work to kind of understand and rank where those funds should go.
And okay, and so for the all right, keep going. I might have more questions about that.
Oh, definitely. Happy to answer that. And so I first wanted to take a minute to just thank you all for the great work you did with the Budget Adjustment Act. Obviously, that's over in the Senate, and we are working to ensure that the Senate adopts the recommendations that you all had made around extending the winter weather program for GA, around the VHCB funding, and around the Developmental Disabilities Housing Initiative funding. Those are three really important pieces that we see as necessary for the remainder of this fiscal year to help address the crisis that we all know we have in Vermont. And I thought I'd talk a little about this, and these are in the notes that I provided you, in the documents I provided you, to kind of break up my testimony into two phases. One is really kind of dig into what the problem is, and then talk about solutions. And so just to give you all have heard some of this before in other testimony, but a kind of an understanding of the problem or the crisis we have in Vermont. So as you all may know, or many of you all know, we count the number of unhoused people in Vermont annually and across the nation in what's called the PIT count, or the point in time count. And so this year it happened, I believe, on January 22nd. We should have that new data available in a couple of months. But going off of the most recent available data, which was the 2024 PIT count, we had approximately 3,500 unhoused Vermonters across our state, including 737 children and 646 Vermonters over 55 years old. And we know, because of a number of other data sources that we have, including coordinated entry, including kind of the night counts at some of the shelters, that 3,500 number is an undercount. How much of an undercount, we don't know precisely, but we do know it's an undercount. And that number also represents an over 300% increase between 2020 and 2024. And so obviously that shows that the crisis in Vermont is getting worse. Looking at Vermont compared to other states, we have the fourth highest per capita rate of homelessness in the entire country. Connected clearly to this as well is the housing crisis that we have in Vermont. And so I know the housing crisis is slightly outside this committee's jurisdiction, but if it's okay, I'd love to kind of connect all the dots for purposes of the kind of scoping the problem. And so in Vermont, the Vermont State Vermont Housing Finance Agency put out the most recent housing needs assessment last fall. And that showed we needed between 24 and 36,000 additional year-round homes by the end of this decade to address the housing crisis. And that includes 3,295 homes that will need to address the homelessness, and another 3,900 plus homes to address normalized vacancy rates. And vacancy rates is obviously really important, because one of the key drivers of the homelessness crisis we have right now in Vermont is the rising gap between wages and cost of living. And so that shows kind of the scope of problem that we have. And so to put that in context of what our current system can handle, we have a statewide shelter capacity currently right now of 618 households. And so looking at the numbers just on paper, 618 shelter capacity, over 3,500 unhoused people, that is a massive gap in capacity for addressing the needs of unhoused Vermonters across our state. And so one of the key solutions to that over the last couple of years has been the General Assistance Emergency Housing Program. So that's why, as I mentioned in my intro around thanking you all for the BAA work, that program is so vital in the interim as we work to build out the permanent solutions to this crisis. So right now in the GA program, I think we have over 1,400 households. And as you all know from the work you've done, that program is only limited to Vermonters that the legislature has deemed as vulnerable. So seniors, people with disabilities, people fleeing domestic violence, people with children, et cetera. And so I think that shows right now the importance of, as we kind of build out a permanent solution, maintaining that backstop that we have right now with GA as we work through a solution. Because as we saw last September, without any additional capacity, what we do is we exit people into communities that have zero resources. And so, looking back to where we were in September, we had shelter providers, people giving out tents to families with children, to people on oxygen, to people with disabilities, et cetera. And I think one of the really important things that we want to also lift up that we hear often in this debate is, it's just so expensive to address this crisis. And so, let's just not spend the dollars, and then we will say, we can invest those elsewhere. And I think that really ignores a fundamental issue within the housing and homelessness crisis, is that it costs a lot more money for us at the state level to ignore this crisis than to invest in the solutions to this crisis. And so, what I mean by that, there was a pre-COVID study that looked at the annual cost to taxpayers of an individual in chronic homelessness, and it was $35,000 per year per individual. And so adjusting that to inflation, that is over $45,000 in 2024 dollars that we are spending every year because we are not addressing chronic homelessness and the homelessness crisis in our state. And that manifests in many ways. It manifests in because those individuals will use ER as their primary healthcare needs, which is drastically more expensive. Our criminal legal system becomes involved, which is extremely expensive and extremely ineffective at addressing the root causes of homelessness. So all of those things come together and show that the cost is much more expensive of ignoring this crisis than investing in this crisis. Also would love to point out that, we often hear that, folks will just, figure out other places for them to go in the interim. And so people can couch surf, et cetera. And note that couch surfing does not, couch surfing, according to HUD, is still homelessness because those individuals don't have a home. And I think more practically speaking, when we rely on couch surfing, we are putting additional people at risk of homelessness because, as you all know, when you have a lease agreement, it says who is allowed to be in that household. And so if you have people couch surfing there as well, it not only puts that unhoused person at risk of becoming unhoused again, but also the entire community living in that house is at risk of becoming homeless themselves because they can be evicted for breaking their lease. We also often hear about solutions, including congregate shelter, and I think it's really important to note that.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Something just happened with your microphone.
Can you hear me?
Now, yeah.
Okay, I apologize for that. I think just would also really love to point out that we've heard often that congregate shelter should be something that we should be lifting up. And, pre-COVID, I think congregate shelter was a much more common tool that we used. But because of COVID, because we moved people out of congregate facilities because of the public health crisis, researchers were able to study this and understand the benefits and the costs of using congregate versus non-congregate models. And what they found is that congregate is a much less effective option at addressing the homelessness crisis. And as I know in site research in the documents that you have, when people are not in congregate, they have a greater feeling of stability, of safety, of health, of well-being. It enables them to focus on moving out of homelessness, identifying opportunities for employment easier, identifying educational opportunities easier. It also reduces the chances of conflict between people within the facility or between people and staff. And it also ensures, and we've seen better results at people getting access to services and participating in services because they are able to build that stability on the front end. And finally, before I talk about solutions, just really want to lift up one additional thing that I think is often not discussed is the staggering racial disparities in both our homelessness crisis in Vermont and in our housing crisis in Vermont. And so looking at the numbers that VHFA has put together, for example, on the housing side, 74% of white Vermonters own their home compared to just 27% of Black Vermonters own their home. And we've actually seen a decrease in Black home ownership in the last 10 years. On the homelessness side, Black Vermonters are 5.6 times more likely than white Vermonters to be unhoused. And so I think there's many reasons for this. We have kind of the legacy of racist policy in our country that has created a vast racial wealth divide. We have, disproportionate enforcement of our criminal laws in Vermont, which means that white people are much less likely than Black people to be arrested for the same offense. All those come together to create this crisis that we have, where we have Black Vermonters being unhoused and lack of home ownership at staggering rates compared to white Vermonters. And so I can pause there if it's okay, if folks have questions about kind of scoping the problem before I get into solutions, or do you want me to just go right into solutions?
Thank you, Frank. We do have a couple of questions. Representative Bishop, then Steady.
Yes, thank you. You were touching upon studies that indicate that congregate housing is less effective. And in Vermont, the alternative to congregate housing is the voucher program we have for motels. Where these studies were conducted, and some may have been Vermont, some elsewhere, I'm not sure, where they were conducted, what was the alternative to congregate housing that was proving more effective?
It was a single occupancy. So basically, it wasn't looking at the hotel motel program in Vermont, but the same type of outcome where people have personal space and they have their own room to keep their belongings.
Okay, but single occupancy, maybe you can help me better understand that term, single occupancy, where you were able to get people into more of an apartment type setting, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
So an apartment where they're able to kind of have closed doors and personal space versus just a number of cots in a room.
Thank you.
So I think that really shows the kind of the GA model of getting people into personal space, into a hotel room, or getting people into an apartment type situation is a much more effective solution than continuing to go with the congregate model. And I think one other thing I'd love to point out too, we work obviously with our hat as the collaborative applicant for the Balanced State with shelter providers across Vermont. And so we've had conversations with our providers on a number of occasions about this. And, the goal from the provider perspective is not, we have 3,500 unhoused people at a minimum in Vermont. We have 618 shelter household capacity. The goal from the provider perspective is not to build that out to 3,500 because they know that is not effectively addressing the kind of solutions in the crisis. They'd love to see as much money as possible going into solutions, including permanently affordable housing opportunities. And so that's why I think there's a lot of support within the provider network for the GA program, because it is much more cost-effective way at addressing the immediate crisis of keeping a roof over people's heads while we can invest more dollars into actual solutions, which is permanent affordable housing.
And we did hear yesterday from BHCB that essentially the same money that, they have choices to make in terms of where they invest the money, and the same money that they might invest in a shelter could actually, jumpstart and provide permanent housing. And so, they have this stress in the system about whether to prioritize shelters or permanent housing with this same dollar, so Representative Steady.
I think I'll wait. Are you going, I've just been reading your paperwork. Are you just going through your paperwork? My question might be later.
Yes, he's going to move to his suggested solutions.
I'll wait.
Okay.
I'll wait.
All right. Is there any other questions at this point in time? Okay, thank you, Frank. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. And so on the solutions, I'm going to work backward of how it is in the document that I gave you all, in part because the first is really about permanently affordable housing, which is more in housing in general's jurisdiction. But looking at this kind of at three tiers, so we have the immediate crisis and how do we solve the immediate crisis of over 3,500 unhoused people. The next tier is how do we mitigate this crisis getting worse, and that's really services and supports. And then the ultimate solution is housing. So I'm going to work kind of up that track. And so from our perspective, and we were a member of the General Assistance Emergency Housing Task Force, we really support the work that task force did and the time that task force put in for its recommendations. And one of the documents that I included in the packet that I sent into y'all and you all should have is a letter with, I think, approximately 60 organizations from across Vermont signing on in support of the GA task force recommendations. And so I think from our perspective, those recommendations are really kind of what we hope would be a core part of whatever package that your committee is working on right now. And if it's okay, I can kind of focus on a few areas within that package that we think are really important. And first is the kind of the use of what currently is and what would trip on April 1st if we don't extend winter weather is the use of 80 nights as a nightcap for length of stay for people eligible for GA. Excuse me. And one of the things we think is really important and the task force took time to look at is, ensuring that as we move forward, we have a metric that measures length of stay that's actually based on facts on the ground. And so instead of having 80 days or 28 days or some number that's not based in reality, using the data sets that we have, which we have vast data sets to understand, like, what is the actual average length of stay it takes for someone to move from homelessness into permanent housing. And that really should be the basis for any average length of stay eligibility under the program. And so we would urge this committee to follow the committee's recommendation around that piece. And there's a footnote in the legislation that notes that measurement tool and how that measurement tool is to be utilized. Our thought process is that every year, as the state is thinking about what is that length of stay that we should use this year, whatever that HUD metric is that we have the data for should really serve as the basis for that. And that is something that will change every year. And so as the state invests more in solutions and more affordable housing, can move more people into housing, that length of stay for GA would naturally decrease. And so it gives us, but it also ensures that we're based on reality. I think another piece that we think is really important is rethinking how we're using the winter weather program and moving back to the way it was in previous years. And so in previous years, if you were unhoused during the winter weather period, you were eligible for general assistance emergency housing. And this year, with changes made last year, only people who are categorically eligible for GA are eligible for GA in the winter program. And I think one of the things that this legislature did last year was it set aside funding to try and step up emergency shelter capacity for folks who don't meet the criteria but are unhoused in the winter. And I think we saw that is not necessarily the most effective way of doing things, because the state was not able to do that in the time period that they had. And so our hope is that we continue to just kind of utilize the GA program to relax the requirements for eligibility in the wintertime to ensure that we have no folks freezing to death in Vermont. I think a third piece is ensuring that all state agencies are fully participating in the homelessness response system. So in coordinated entry, et cetera. I think we've seen, in multiple occasions that folks in the hotel motel program, for example, are not necessarily always getting connected into the homelessness response system that we have in Vermont. And so, as you all, I think, have heard before, coordinated entry, which is the system that really helps to track and prioritize unhoused Vermonters, connecting them to housing opportunities, connecting them to service opportunities. That is really the kind of core tool that we have to be able to track and match unhoused people with outputs that they may need and solutions that they may need, and ensuring that the state is connecting everyone within the hotel motel program into that system is something that we think is really, really important. We've heard some positive things over the past couple of months that's happening more and more, but I think ensuring that is something that's happening is something that is key. I think a couple of the other recommendations are going to get at some of the other kind of buckets that I wanted to talk about, but also ensuring that we continue the pipeline of permanently affordable housing production so that we have that solution opportunity available to move people into, because, as we think about the coordinated entry system, it's just that it's a system. It requires the outputs to function correctly. And so if we don't have the services that are necessary to connect people to, if we don't have the housing that is needed to kind of connect people to, the coordinated entry system can't properly function. And so we can't actually have the system flowing the way it should. And so investing in those outputs, we think, is really, really important. And finally, thinking about what zoning hurdles we still have in place. And so, for example, in some jurisdictions, if you're trying to do a motel conversion, that could be and I'm just spitballing numbers here, but it could be, a 100-room motel. But if you're trying to convert that into permanent housing, the local zoning restrictions could say, hey, you can only have 10 housing units out of this 100-unit hotel. And so figuring out ways where we can relax those to ensure that we can continue to maximize capacity as we transition from emergency shelter into permanent housing. I think the second bucket I would love to talk about is kind of homelessness prevention programs. And so these are the things that we think about if, we have the immediate crisis, we have GA, we have emergency shelter for the immediate crisis of homelessness, but then there's a whole number of people in Vermont who are at risk of homelessness. And so, how do we continue to prevent more people from becoming unhoused in Vermont? And also moving people who are unhoused into permanent housing. And so that's really done in a couple of different core ways in Vermont, one of which is through the HOP program. And so ensuring that this legislature continues to invest in the HOP program, we think is vital in terms of both not only the shelter side, but also the housing navigators, landlord liaisons, et cetera. And then the other piece that we would hope and urge this legislature to consider moving into the HOP program are the currently funded ERAP positions. That those ERAP funds are federal funds that will go away at the end of this fiscal year, at the end of June. But those are funding core positions right now across our state to keep people housed. And so ensuring that those positions don't go away and we don't make this crisis worse. And I know I'm kind of short on time, so I didn't know if there were questions at this point. I can continue talking, but most of this is in the notes that I gave you all.
Thank you, Frank. Yes, I mean, you've been very helpful in sort of looking at what the priorities are from your perspective. And that's helpful for us to consider. Why don't we thank you also for being cognizant of the time constraints we have. We have a lot of witnesses today. So I just want to check in. Representative Steady, did you have a question?
Might not be for him or, like there's the HOP program, BHSCB, BHSF. Okay, I see on his presentation, 80 million, 34.9 million, 36 million. And then do we have HOP on top of that? How do you know
Well, in
services aren't intertwining and we're giving money, these millions of dollars to all of them to do the same thing?
So in the presentation that Frank just had, he's specific about to which agency and which program and for what services. So I think that, you know, when we talk about it, like we talked some about yesterday about the rental assistance and eviction prevention and the perhaps overlap between what
Right.
the State Housing Authority does and what HOP providers do. And, you know, with limited resources, do we prioritize it in one area or the other, or do we continue to have both? You know, I think that's worthy of our discussion when we get to committee discussion about the bill and about budget, frankly. So,
Yeah, because the deputy commissioner said some people are already being housed and then they come there and get another 80 days and she has no way of knowing. When she presented, she said somebody had gotten
Deputy Commissioner
7
Gray.
days and then they came and got another 80 days because there's no way of telling who's already getting the days.
well, they keep track of the 80 days. You don't get 80 and 80. It's
No, she said somebody had already gotten 7 days with another agency. And then, they can't count that when they do the 80 days. Remember when she presented? No, I
well,
don't know that.
okay, and we don't need to argue about that right now.
I just don't want the same services being paid for by the taxpayers over and over.
I understand your point of view.
Thanks.
Representative Donahue.
Yes, thank you. You referenced the studies on that analyzed congregate, non-congregate, and other people have mentioned that. I haven't been able to find them. And you have a citation with a link that I clicked on, and it's got a paywall barrier. So I'm wondering if you have a copy of that you could forward or share with us. It's the one it's number 13 on your footnotes. The Greg Coburn study, hotels as non-congregate emergency shelters analysis.
I was able to open it.
Really? I opened it and got, but that's only the, now click on where it says, then you go to the whole thing and it also just gives you the summary and then a paywall for getting the, that's exactly where I went. And if you scroll down, then it tells you how much you have to pay to, oh wait, you've got, notes somewhere. It's like, if you want the whole thing, it's, $100 or whatever.
Oh, yeah, purchase options.
There we go. Purchase options if you want more than the little summary.
If you
The
have,
little summary is 24 pages.
That's, the one I got was just the, what's it called? The abstract, the abstract.
I have 24 page article.
Oh, well, maybe you could forward them to.
Okay.
Unless you can't get it.
all right, so it looks
So
like
we
we can
have it
take care
here.
of it. We can
Yeah,
take care of it.
thank
you. All righty.
Print a
Are there any final questions for Frank? Go ahead, Representative Bishop.
If I understood correctly, you referenced a disconnect, if you will, with some of the state agencies ensuring that people who are entering the voucher program get access to the full panoply of services. Do you have any thoughts on what's creating that disconnect or why that problem exists? Because I would think that defeats some of the benefits of people in that living situation versus congregate housing. There are many reasons you point to for why not to have congregate housing, but I would think that's one of them, and it seems like we're defeating that purpose or missing out on an opportunity.
Yeah, my understanding, so these are, I think, questions that AHS or ESD in particular could potentially answer better. My understanding is it often comes down to just capacity and staffing and the kind of work it takes to complete a coordinated entry intake and refer some folks. So I think that's my understanding. But I've also talked with some of our the folks that we work with through the Balance of State. And my understanding is that, over the past couple of months, they've been getting more consistent reports in connection of who's in the motel hotel program. And then if they have the capacity, they can send folks in to do the coordinated entry assessments. But at least they're getting lists of who's in. So, but I think formalizing that would be really, really helpful and important.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just brings up a lot of questions about coordinated entry for me, to be honest with you. Okay, Frank, thank you very much. And I hope you feel better. And thank you for the information you forwarded. And it looks like at least some of us can get access to that article. And so we're
Forward
they're going to forward it to us, right? I couldn't get it either. But thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony this morning.
Great. Appreciate your time and thank you. And if there are any documents y'all need access to, just please let me know and I'll work to get them to the committee.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, next we're going to move on to folks who provide shelter services in some of our network of shelters. And it looks like we have a couple of folks here already. Okay, great. We have all three people here. So Julie, why don't you join us at the table and we'll do a round of introductions since this is the first time the three of you have been here. Thank you for being here, all three of you. Appreciate it. So my name is Teresa Wood. I'm from Waterbury, and I also serve Bolton, Buellscore, and Huntington.
Ann Donahue, Northfield, and also serve Berlin.
Good morning, I'm Dan Noyes. I represent Wolcott, Hyde Park, Johnson, and Belvedere.
Brenda Steady, East Milton, Westford.
Doug Bishop, Colchester.
Good morning, Todd Nielsen, representing Brandon McCarthy.
Good morning, Hassan Eastus. I represent Guilford and Vernon.
Hi, I'm Esme Cole. I represent Hartford.
Julie McGill, Bridport, Middlebury, New Haven, and Whitebridge.
Good morning, Ray Garofano, Essex and Essex Junction. I am Lori Morse, committee assistant.
Good morning, Community Road Action Circles.
Hi, Beverly Bogat, Vermont Early Childhood Advocacy Alliance.
Around here.
I'm Bailey Getlick. I'm representing Wallingford. Good morning, I'm Oliver Medeiros. I work for Department of Children and Families for Vermont. Good morning, I'm Brenda Siegel, the Executive Director of Homelessness Vermont. Good morning, I'm Alice Scrambless, I'm the ACLU from Vermont.
And why don't we go on screen?
After you, Michael.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Michael Redmond. I'm the Executive Director of the Upper Valley Haven, located in Hartford.
And I'm John Hoover, Assistant Executive Director for Groundworks Collaborative, located in Brattleboro.
Great, thank you. And go ahead.
And I'm Julie Bond, the Executive Director of Good Samaritan Haven here in Washington County.
So Julie, why don't you start us off? And we do have testimony from Julie on our website as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for being here.
So for the record, my name is Julie Bond. I'm the Executive Director of Good Samaritan Haven, a shelter network serving those experiencing homelessness in Washington County and the broader central Vermont region. Thanks for inviting me here to address these questions today. So for context, Good Samaritan Haven operates 4 shelter facilities with a capacity of 82 emergency beds serving adults 18 to 80 plus years old. An intentional and very important feature of our program is that it functions as a continuum of care and services for the unhoused. Our shelter provides a range of access from a very low barrier seasonal congregate shelter in Montpelier to a low barrier semi-congregate shelter in Barrie, to semi-private rooms in our shelter in Berlin, to semi-private rooms in a recovery-oriented shelter in Barrie Town. And that's a hybrid shelter recovery home model for those recovering from substance use disorder. Our staff provides housing navigation and support services to motels. We operate a seasonal warming space in Montpelier. Our outreach team engages with 75 to 100 plus individuals who are unsheltered in the county with life supporting supplies, services, connection. And finally, our housing navigation and case management teams help our guests obtain the needed IDs, connection to services, help referrals, training and education, housing, obviously, and employment to meet their goals. So Good Sam employs about 55 people currently to conduct this very challenging and complex work. In our experience, one size does not fit all in assisting the unhoused. Our guest population is incredibly diverse. We serve an adult population with deep complexity of needs. Close to half our guests are impacted by mental health conditions, most often moderately, but sometimes quite profound. 86% of our guests report some form of disability, whether it be physical, medical, mental health, developmental. Older individuals, 55 and over, who are seeking shelter for the first time now account for over 50% of our shelter occupancy. So that's a really big demographic shift that needs to be tended to and noted. Nearly half of our guests struggle with substance use disorder. There's also many who are not in recovery, do not use substances at all. Many have impacts related to involvement with the correctional system. Most are very limited or no income at all. And overarching, all of this is the extremely tight housing market. So there's few low-cost options. This fall, when the impacts of the changes to the motel program resulted in ultra-vulnerable adults and children being put to the street after their 80 days of motel stays had run out, shelter providers fell into deep crisis alongside those losing their motel stays. This destabilization of the system threatened the lives of many and prevented and distracted shelters from serving people in their normal way and resulted in deep strain and moral injury placed upon both vulnerable Vermonters and Vermont's emergency shelter providers. So Good Sam mobilized with End Homelessness Vermont and several local churches in our area in Barrie and Montpelier to take action by raising funds from individuals, from foundations around the state and our community to extend motel stays and to shelter about 76 individuals, about a third of the population in the motels in the county. And that includes 14 families and 19 children, with 19 children. And that was from about September 19th to December 1st. Examples of those assisted through that Motel Bridge program that we enacted was a blind woman with a newborn trying to avoid sleeping in a tent, a grandmother with sole custody of an autistic grandchild, a gentleman with a traumatic brain injury who relied on oxygen, wheelchair-bound individuals with multiple serious health conditions, bedridden individuals, an older woman suffering from chronic debilitating back pain that prevented her from sleeping on the ground in a tent. So despite these Herculean efforts that we conducted, several people still died. We lost people in our community. The decision-making process to triage how to extend motel stays for individuals with these levels of complex conditions fell on the shoulders of oftentimes just me. And this nearly killed me, and I am not over-exaggerating that. So that level of moral injury that one person should not have to bear alone is really something. Were it not for our already established partnership with End Homelessness Vermont, with our community partners in our towns, many more people would have died in the community. So I really want to be clear, this is not a solution that we should have had to have entertained. We were responding to policy-made crisis, and it was the only ethical solution that we felt existed for us as providers. So that really must never happen again. So as such, I implore you to ensure that there's no cap on the number of days people have in the motel program, and no cap on the number of rooms. It simply will destroy the state's shelter infrastructure, our staff, those who hold that system together, as well as those feeling the shun of having nowhere else to go but outside, those who are affected deeply. So the following are suggestions for how to wage sustainable and beneficial change in the state's shelter system and emergency housing programs. First, engage in parallel change. So please do not shutter one program without having another waiting in the wings or completely ready to begin, or in fact, having already begun. Do not create a cliff, on which we will perish. Please ask shelter providers for their ideas and feedback and plans. As many shelter providers submitted over $30+ million in proposals last July, requesting shelter expansion funds for projects that were already in development. I repeat, our organizations have our own strategic development priorities already. We know what's needed in the communities. We simply need the funds and the flexibility to expend the funds across budget cycles to make that happen. The Good Sam alone submitted $9 million in requests for shelter expansion projects that were not funded, including our plans for a complex care shelter and a year-round shelter in Montpelier. So if either of those projects had been funded in July, we'd be close to having 60 to 70 additional shelter beds in the region by now. So please take into consideration what's already in development in the pipeline by shelter providers versus untested solutions. General assistance emergency shelter must be a backstop. So until there is capacity for our state's service providers to handle the need, in order to ensure that our state does not see a crisis of sheltering again, the GA emergency shelter must continue. We support the GA Emergency Housing Task Force recommendations for this part of the sheltering program. And this, with parallel action to expand our shelter and housing infrastructure, can work to lower the level of crisis and begin to move the state forward. Creating large congregate shelters is not the answer. They're incredibly difficult to manage. It's not humane for anyone, let alone people with deep complexities. The individuals that we're serving currently, and it should not be considered as a long-term solution. This type of sheltering is only meant for like 3 to 7 days, that kind of situation, like the string of weather events we've had where our partners in the Red Cross operate such a system. That's super temporary. It's not meant for, folks who are ending up in 9 months to 2+ years in a shelter system. That's just not sustainable. Please take into consideration the local shelter providers want to help. We want to expand capacity, but we must be able to do so in sustainable ways. We can only expand and staff programs safely and appropriately if we have both the operational funds and the administrative funds to support that, to make that happen. So no organization can expand precipitously, without administrative support to ground its operations. The HOP funds, which fund shelter operations, do not fund administration. That's very, very important to take into consideration. That's not sustainable and must be reconsidered if we want local shelter providers to be part of the long-term solution versus out-of-state contractors, for example. There also must be flexibility in spending for the purposes of expanding shelter that is not hemmed in by rigid budget cycles. So please communicate with local shelter providers if there's short-term weather-related shelters that are being considered to be put up in the area. Be in touch with us so we can potentially be part of that solution, or simply know that a resource is being mobilized, because we're all in this together and we're happy to try to help when we can. And consider shelters and other models of care for specific populations. So it can be helpful to focus on the creation of shelters for specific needs, such as complex healthcare needs, families with children, recovery-oriented shelters. However, please don't lose sight of the fact that more group homes from those with mental health conditions or developmental disabilities must be created. And it's imperative that more focus is placed on getting more skilled nursing facilities, long-term healthcare facilities, nursing homes back into the local communities. I beg of you. Shelter providers are currently caring for some of the most complex and vulnerable people in the state because of the lack of these vital clinical or supportive housing resources. Shelters are not clinical facilities. We're not rehab facilities. We're not inpatient psychiatric facilities. And that's what we're currently serving us. Okay. Fund a diversity of supports and services. So the people that we work with in hotels and in our shelters utilize a diversity of support systems. So some may work well with one provider, while others work much better with another. That's just, the way it is with trauma cycles and personalities and different things like that. Some may do best with a team approach, for example, utilizing support from multiple providers, but there has to be choice in the service support. I will not be able to meet individualized needs and plans. And while specific, I'd like to name that End Homelessness Vermont in their Office of Housing Advocate fills an ombudsman role, and they should be funded in that role. It's really vital. It's a critical service that many of us providers rely on. It's currently unfunded. It's key to the complexities of needs that we're seeing out there. Their independence allows them to advocate for clients quite thoroughly. It's something that we simply don't have the capacity and sometimes the expertise to be doing, right? So that's necessary, and it's previously a missing part of our current homelessness support system. A well-rounded system that's designed for the crisis that we're experiencing right now has to have all the pieces in place to make it effective. So in short, people need housing options to be as unique as they are, must be not be housed in congregate settings for long periods of time. If large numbers of individuals get unsheltered in the future, it will destabilize the shelter provider network around the state. It's super unsustainable. It's really, really difficult. Our overriding recommendation for the state's response to homelessness crisis, whether it's 200 more shelter beds, 1,000 more, is to take the time, make the long-term investment in providing strategic ranges of emergency shelter options and a better integration of services in what currently exists. Our own top priorities in Washington County would be low and very low barrier shelter options to house the current population. That's 1 to 200 additional bed capacity as a low estimate. Emergency shelter for persons who need support around their complex needs, beyond the traditional shelter what we can provide, and additional family sheltering options and domestic violence sheltering options. So these challenges are significant, but they really can be addressed with holistic strategy and commitment. It'll take a long game approach, one that spans budget cycles, one that incorporates adequate and ongoing funding levels to enable strategic shelter expansion and organizational administrative capacity to weather that expansion safely and sustainably. So we look forward to working with the state, with our partners as ever, and thank you. Happy for questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the specific warnings and and requests. I think it's always important for us to hear impact of policy decisions on the ground, and you've been very articulate in sharing that with us. So we really appreciate that. I have a couple of questions. You're not the first witness to talk about the significant needs of individuals and the what feels like a lack of addressing them from the what I'll call the policy department. So whether it's the Department of Disability and Independent Living for older Vermonters and people with physical and developmental disabilities, or whether it's the Department of Mental Health for people with mental health issues, or the health department for people with substance use issues, although there seems to be more action in there because there's actually some money that comes, there's been a lot more investments there, frankly, than there have been in the other two areas. And so I'm just curious if, either representatives from the Department of Mental Health or from Dale have been in contact with shelter providers, or you with them, and what kind of reaction or response that you may have received.
Yeah, I mean, we work with all of them in various ways. It's really often very individualized to the specific guests that we're working with who have really complex situations that we're trying to navigate. Folks that truly have more complex needs than we're able to provide, which happens quite a lot. It's often maybe a lack of an alternative setting, because what I said is there's no group homes enough in the volume that we need. Skilled nursing facilities and nursing homes and so on, memory care units, things like that. I have people with dementia, I have people with very, very complex mental health, and
There are beds, that's the problem. I mean, there are beds in nursing facilities.
if they don't, one of the things, and I'll say this very clearly, like if somebody smokes, they're not allowed in a facility.
Yeah.
So until that changes, you're not going to have a change in the homelessness situation.
Yeah,
And
and that's not going to, I'm pretty sure that's not going to change.
Well, that's discriminatory, and I'll put that on the record.
Yeah.
It's harming us. So that is one thing. If a place doesn't accept the Medicaid, then we can't place them there. And that's just not happening. It's not like they might just not be able to do that because it's not affordable for them to operate their organization. That hampers our ability to serve anybody.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's not something.
I'm not
we can-
feeling too bad about nursing facilities, to be honest with you. I mean, we've put tens of millions of dollars in there in the last 2 to 3 years. I mean, this year alone, we've put, well, if you count budget adjustment and the 26 budget, close to $100 million.
Yeah, and I'm not worried about them. I just need beds in them. I cannot
Yeah.
get people out of my shelter.
That's my point, is that they should be more flexible
That's
than
right.
they are. Yeah. Because they have resources, and I realize it's a difficult thing, but, so I appreciate that. I appreciate
Yeah,
that a lot. Other questions for this witness? Thank you so much for sharing, really the impact on the ground, for you. And, thank you for your ongoing work with your folks. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
John or Michael, who wants to go first? Or second, I should say.
Whatever you like, John.
I'll take a go because
Okay.
I have something after this that eventually I have to get to. So
Great.
Okay, alrighty.
well, actually, I wanted to remark on something Julie said, but just for the record, John Hoover, Assistant Executive Director for Groundworks Collaborative. And before I go into my prepared remarks, one thing I didn't touch on that Julie covered very thoroughly was she painted a picture of the community that Good Sam serves, and it was very unfortunately relatable for what we're seeing in Brattleboro, particularly around the complexity of need and how that's challenging. When she said, we're not a treatment facility, we're not for substance use or mental health, that's relatable because that is a significant portion of the people we are serving and trying to support to the best of our abilities as non-healthcare providers. But that's the need that many people are presenting in our shelters or in our community, and that's a challenge. So thank you, Julie, for speaking to that. Coming over to the remarks I prepared.
And John,
yeah.
I was just gonna say, John and Michael, if you have prepared remarks, it'd be great if you could send them to our committee assistant, Lori Morris, so that we can post them on our website.
I will certainly do so. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. Groundworks Collaborative, based out of Brattleboro, works with people and systems to create solutions to end hunger and homelessness for all people in our region. Amongst other programs, we operate a 34-bed shelter that, given the current need and weather, currently serves 40 to 46 people each night. Additionally, we provide outreach and case management to homeless households that are unsheltered or in the motel program. Lastly, we have under development a 40-bed shelter that is expected to open in the summer of 2026. First, I want to commend the legislature for taking up this critical issue. The severity of Vermont's housing crisis demands thoughtful, systematic changes to our emergency shelter system. and this bill represents an important step towards creating more consistent long-term solutions. There are several elements of H91 that represent significant improvements to our current system. The establishment of clear appeal rights and processes will better protect our most vulnerable neighbors. The winter shelter provisions from November to April provide critical life-saving protection. The bill's emphasis on community-based shelter over motels creates opportunities for more effective service delivery. The creation of an advisory committee, including people with lived experience, will ensure that future policy decisions are informed by those most directly affected. However, I must raise several concerns about key task force recommendations that weren't included in the current bill. The decision to maintain fixed duration limits of 45 or 90 days, rather than supporting people until they secure housing, will create new cycles of instability. Moreover, it plainly will undermine the stated legislative intent in the bill. I'm also particularly concerned about the bill's silence on resource testing requirements. The task force specifically recommended removing resource tests entirely, recognizing that anyone experiencing homelessness needs immediate support and that requiring people to spend down savings before receiving assistance can create barriers to long-term stability. I strongly encourage the committee to explicitly address resource testing in the bill's language rather than leaving this critical decision to departmental rulemaking. Speaking to the specific impact on Groundworks Collaborative of this draft bill, our primary concern centers on the increased demands for coordinated entry and case management services. While we support the goal of better service coordination, implementing these requirements effectively will require significant additional resources. Our current system is already stretched thin, and the mandatory case management requirements after 14 days will require substantial new capacity. While funding mechanisms fall outside the scope of H91, I urge the legislature to consider these crucial funding needs in tandem through the appropriations process. Last fall, OEOs surveyed coordinated entry providers, and the cost to expand capacity throughout the state was slightly over $1 million. Unfortunately, only a quarter of applicable funds were able to be obtained from HUD through the balance of states' application. The full funding of expanded coordinated entry positions throughout the state by backfilling and matching HUD grants is critical to the success of this new system. Additionally, I strongly encourage the consideration of 2-year contracts between AHS and service providers. This longer contractual timeline would allow organizations like Groundworks to better plan for capacity changes and maintain stable staffing levels. At Groundworks, we're currently piloting the PSHA Medicaid funding mechanism for housing case management. While this innovative approach shows promise, it's important to understand that it's a complex contracting mechanism that differs significantly from traditional grants. The administrative requirements are substantial, and the billing structure can create cash flow challenges for organizations. While we support expanding this program, we must stress the importance of also maintaining and increasing funding for case management services through the HOP grant. These funding streams serve different purposes and populations. The Medicaid mechanism, while valuable, cannot replace the flexibility and accessibility of grant-funded services. Many of our clients face barriers to Medicaid enrollment, and the HOP grant allows us to provide immediate, flexible support and is more accessible to a wide variety of organizations. In Brattleboro, we're seeing firsthand how these various funding mechanisms interact and where gaps remain. When inadequate funding forces us to turn people away, when resource testing depletes their savings, or when case management capacity is stretched too thin, we see the ripple effects throughout our community. Each barrier to immediate assistance not only creates unnecessary human suffering, but also impacts our broader community, from increased strain on emergency services to challenges for local businesses and public spaces. Our experience suggests that a combination of stable, predictable funding sources, each with their own strengths, provides the most comprehensive support for our neighbors experiencing homelessness while also benefiting the wider community. Getting this right means thinking holistically about both emergency response and long-term solutions. I'd be happy to answer any questions about our experience implementing these various funding mechanisms or about the direct impacts we're seeing on the ground in Brattleboro. Thank you for your time and consideration on these important issues.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Questions from folks? Yeah, go ahead.
If I understood correctly, I think you mentioned that community-based shelters can create opportunities for better service delivery. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. In terms of, I do want to say in terms of sort of experience in shelter, there's definitely trade-offs wherein something like a congregate shelter that we operate gives us a lot of opportunity for service engagement. If we have case managers who are working in the shelter in the same space with the people that they're supporting, then a lot of the barriers to contact, coordination, or even, frankly, staff safety when it comes to motel visits is largely addressed. That said, some people do better in either a semi or non-congregate shelter arrangement, be that a motel or some other approach. But ultimately, it kind of comes down to a coordination issue. The case manager needs to be working with the person. What's the easiest way to work with someone? Well, if your office is in where they're living, then you're going to get a lot more work and contact done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question about the case management and the thoughts that you raised about that.
Yeah.
And looking through, there's no like sort of concise summary of where of the HOP grants. I mean, we can look down and see, which agencies got funded for what things. It seems like there are a lot of different agencies that get funded for, I guess I would call variations on case management and service coordination. And then including direct funding from HUD to the COC folks for that same service. And yet, as you said, and as we've heard in testimony, that there can be, sometimes several months delay in actually getting somebody through the assessment process for the COC. And as you noted, in the current version of the bill, it requires something like that after 14 days for a participant to agree to participate in COC assessment process. And where I'm going with this is that, the housing folks, the people who provide permanent housing, use the continuum of care information from which to make referrals for permanent housing. So if somebody's not in that system, then they have a smaller likelihood of being able to access permanent housing unless, somebody is really kind of working on the ground with them one-on-one and, trying to, like nursing homes don't use the COC process if somebody needs that level of care. I guess what I'm just trying to figure out, I've heard you mention that the OEO had done a survey and it was approximately $1 million in extra case management support that would be needed to better meet the needs of individuals out there. And I guess I'm interested in your thoughts about how effective and efficient, I guess, all the multiple case management allocations going out to all these different organizations, how effective and efficient that is.
Yeah. And if I can, I will answer that directly. If I can pick up one thread that I think would be helpful, and something you said about midway through, just
Okay.
to kind of make more explicit what concerns us about that 14-day requirement is ultimately, for someone who's staying in one of our shelters, assuming, we get the funding we ask for the appropriate number of case managers, has the shelter operator, we can both set an expectation, and like I said, have the client or beneficiary of the services and the case manager in the same building. So I understand the 14-day is more for motel vouchers, but the 14-day engagement in shelter is very doable. Over the past few years, with the benefit of the ERAP funds, we've been able to do a substantial level of housing navigation case management for people in motels. And in no way have we and other agencies in our community been able to have the capacity to serve everybody who's in the motel program in Windham County. And now with ERAP ending, and the only successor mechanism that we're looking at is PSHA, which is the Medicaid funding mechanism and is really great and innovative, but something very different. It would be a concern if we're seeing the same level of homelessness in our community and the way people need in order to maintain their motel voucher is to get case management from Groundworks or other providers. Like ultimately, we would, if them getting on a wait list with us and doing coordinated entry assessment, provided we have the staffing to do that quickly, would satisfy. But it puts us in a really tough position if there's people who need to be engaged with our case management are going to lose their motel housing, and we just don't have the staffing or even a funding mechanism for the staffing to provide that. In terms of your more specific question, I think there's, in the context of, we don't have infinite money, and that's something that you all have to grapple with, and I appreciate you doing that hard work. I kind of think about, some of the trade-offs you might see in the HOP grant between housing prevention or homelessness prevention funding, and versus housing navigation. And the hard part is it's a both end. And I think local community COCs can give guidance on how they want to balance that, for funding for a given AHS district. But ultimately, if you don't support homelessness prevention services, then one, it's a huge detriment to people who are hoping to access those services and can, and then ultimately, you're just need to fund a greater level of housing navigation. So kind of getting that balance is important, and I think local communities can kind of give guidance to the state on how to split that difference.
And do you think that it's, what's most helpful, so we think about the housing navigation, and we think about, sort of more traditional case management and the assessment process. Is it important to have those services, sometimes, I guess, within the same agency or sometimes even within the same person, performing them? Or is it helpful to have a separation of duties?
We found helpful, and ultimately this is just driven a little bit by the funding structure. We've found helpful is segregation of duties between coordinated entry assessment and case management. allows for greater specialization in the specific functions for each of the respective staff people. And also provide some clarity around roles. The coordinated entry assessor, should be very effective relationally, but ultimately they're a little more of a administrator, in a sense of
Mhm.
helping people navigate the system, saying, okay, like here's an opportunity for housing you may wish to access. Your case manager is going to help you pursue that. I'll say kind of one of the other case management gaps, is housing retention. Ultimately, say with ERAP, we get people into housing. OEO has been pretty flexible with saying, yeah, you can stick with the person for a few months, make sure they're settled. But ultimately, and that's appropriate for some people, but ultimately some people aren't prioritized into a housing situation, or they don't find a housing solution that has those long-term supports. In some cases, people get into permanent supportive housing. That's great. Some cases they don't. And then we're just worried that, okay, a year from now, they've had housing. They haven't necessarily had any case management supports. Are we going to see them again because it doesn't work out? And I feel like what would be helpful is to say, which one is the priority. And unfortunately, it's kind of both end, because we're trying to have good touch points in the entire cycle of, unfortunately, a cycle of instability that we're trying to stabilize and really just
Mhm.
get people permanently out of the system of services that we're doing.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Representative Garofano.
Thank you, John. Can you mentioned the Medicaid permanent supportive housing,
Mhm.
and you said it was very different. Can
Mhm.
you, if it's longer than quick, then I can follow up in person, but maybe just highlight some of the major differences between the regular service coordination and what that permanent supportive housing, like what's allowed under that Medicaid?
Yeah. So the set of services that it's funding is housing navigation through long-term housing retention. So when I touched on like you find someone housing, then your services end, that's covered and that's great. The way people access that program is through prioritization off of coordinated entry. They then work with a state case manager employed by OEO to do their Medicaid enrollment, additional verification, and then they are kind of reconnected more formally to a case manager funded by that contract. And, it's a bit different in the sense that we will be, once this program starts, and we plan to have our first participant at the beginning of March, billing Medicaid, just like a insurer does. And so from a fiscal point of view, we have staff, and under a traditional grant, provided we have the staff and, ultimately big picture are performing well as an organization in the program that's funded, we can get reimbursement for that staff person's payroll. In this case, it's much more, we need to build the caseload, and there's a runway provided of some startup funds, but ultimately, we need to have the appropriate amount of clients enrolled for the staff that we're paying in order to get it covered. From a client experience point of view, say at our shelter, we have a case manager funded by the HOP grant. Day one, someone can start engaging with that case manager to work on immediate needs and also start building towards the long term. That's in contrast to PSHA, where there's a bunch of steps that we have to do because it's Medicaid and it's, a more complex funding source until we can actually start working with someone. So that's when I touched on my remarks that flexibility, the grant funding is really supportive of that, and also like much more accessible to organizations at a number of different sizes. The PSHA feels like a lift for us. I think it's going to feel like a lift for the other homeless services providers coming in, because ultimately it's a much more clinical, medical contracting and service model.
Thank you.
But we
And
like it.
Thanks. And I think that while it might hold promise, it's still emerging, let's shall
Yeah.
we say, and we'll need to learn more about it as it gets implemented. And so appreciate that sort of caution about it. And it's quite limited right now, frankly, and they're looking at a quite limited number of people. So thank you very much, John. Appreciate all the work that you're doing there, and appreciate the time you've spent with us this morning.
Yeah, I appreciate you all as well. Thank you for the work that you're doing to work on this.
Okay. Michael,
Hey,
welcome.
thank you. Thank you, Chair Wood, and members of the Human Services Committee, and special greetings to our good friend, Esme Cole from Hartford. My name is Michael Redmond. Again, I'm the Executive Director of the Upper Valley Haven, located in Hartford. I'm also the Treasurer of the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont and serve on its steering committee with Frank and others. I appreciate the opportunity to comment on H91 and some other topics, which propose to establish the Emergency Temporary Shelter Program to replace the General Assistance Housing Program, as well as offer all other thoughts about how Vermont should respond to the number of Vermonters who are without homes. The Upper Valley was founded 45 years ago by concerned people in White River Junction, motivated by their religious faith and a desire to put that faith into concrete action to help their neighbors who had no place to sleep. From that inspiring origin story, the Upper Valley Haven continues to focus on providing shelter to the unhoused, which helps save lives and helping them find housing where they can begin to lead a self-determined life. We currently operate a shelter for adults with 20 beds, a shelter for families for 8 families, and a winter shelter in Lebanon across the river in New Hampshire that is partially funded by Vermont at my request, because Vermonters cross back and forth across the river just as much as New Hampshireites, Granite Staters do, and to have found shelter there this cold winter. And it's a small shelter, but about a third of the beds are used by Vermonters who are there, and then we're running that shelter on behalf of the city of Lebanon. I would note, similar to what Julie said earlier, that the complexity of people is amazing. The diversity of needs. Some falls under patterns that we think of when we think of who's homeless. But I think that now our average age at entry in our adult shelter is 50. That seems to be consistent with what Julie said earlier. And that to bring with them a whole series of health needs that need to be managed that are complex and outside of our scope, and the need for either partnerships that need to be built at the local level ad hoc by organizations. But we wonder whether there couldn't be more coordination that is driven by a state plan rather than just what an individual organization is able to put together with the resources that may be in its community. Just one parenthetically, I'll say, being close to New Hampshire and managing in some of those cases, the county nursing homes are a tremendous resource for us even here in New Hampshire, because they do accept people who smoke and who drink, because they see that as nature of human nature, and private organizations that can pick and choose who they want are always going to be picking and choosing easier cases than what we see every day. Something to think about. Not asking you to build a center, a whole system, but believe me, it has advantages that you don't have here in Vermont. I'm also pleased to report that the Haven plans to break ground this spring on a 20-bed year-round low-barrier shelter, and including a resource center, a day program that will open next year to provide essential shelter and day programming to connect people to needed services and permanent housing. The path to approval of the shelter in Hartford, which had previously been denied by the zoning board, was greatly assisted by the passage of the Home Act of 2023, which included emergency shelters in the list of uses that restricted the actions of municipalities, and offer my deepest gratitude to some of the members around this table and the entire legislature for having the foresight to include shelters in that, to reduce the NIMBYism and allow us to provide the services that communities need. In addition to our shelter programs, the Haven also provides community outreach services focused on helping people obtain and keep housing. This includes staff who focus on receiving emergency shelter through the existing GA emergency housing program in the motels. Today, I'll offer some comments regarding the language and provisions of H91, as well as some thoughts regarding how we move forward with not only focusing on shelter, but actually reducing the number of people who are unhoused in Vermont, which is our goal and the goal of that legislation. First, H91. I applaud the overall goal to eliminate unsheltered homelessness, and interim shelter opportunities provide a stable pathway to permanent housing. Given the focus of this bill, it does provide a solid approach to the first part of this goal, even requires more attention and resources on the second part to achieve the goal of reducing homelessness. And we've heard a lot about that from your other speakers this morning. I welcome the addition of an advisory group to the commissioner composed of people with lived experience and expertise in homelessness. I asked Chelsea, who's my staff, who works at the Haven providing supportive services in the GA emergency housing program, temporarily living in motels, what she thought of the idea. She told me she can think of several people she works with who would be great in this role as representatives from the Hartford district, but she warned the commissioner might not be ready to deal with everything that they would advise him to do. So be careful. But they will be honest, voices for sure. We agree with the shelter first approach for most of the people we work with, that fill up the shelter beds that we have, which are typically full. But there are many for whom congregate shelters, the style used by most organizations, even when there is some level of privacy, which exists at the Haven, our rooms are semi-private, and the family rooms are totally private, would not be appropriate due to their physical health conditions or significant risk of the consequences of infection. People with trauma histories staying in shelters, mental health conditions such as schizophrenia, and other valid reasons why this would be unsuccessful and risky for many. So sometimes shelter first, even if there are beds open, may not be the best option. Again, it comes down to individual needs, understanding the needs of that person in that moment, and that maybe a motel space is the best at that time. Regarding the contracting with motels, we're pleased that there's language that speaks to health standards and fire and building safety through licensing and code adherence. We can hope that these standards and practices would make a significant difference in what we experience today. Perhaps the practice of withholding of payment is one remedy that can result in compliance with these health and safety standards. We can only hope that through these rules, the standards the motels accepted into this new program would result in more livable conditions than exist today. It would seem this should be the minimum the state should accept for the dollars they are providing to the motels to provide this service. The shelters that we operate are subject to rigorous habitability standards of functioning equipment, sanitary spaces, safety protocols, healthy environments. A new program using motels for temporary shelter should settle for nothing less. This would include regular cleaning, standard supplies and rooms, equipment that's repaired promptly, spaces free of vermin. This can only be accomplished through consistent and frequent inspections and actions that deal with the problems that are found without retribution against the people who might be reporting them but are afraid to today. Regarding eligibility, we are disappointed that the state continues to limit eligibility during non-winter months to certain categories of people, leaving out many others who need shelter. We recognize this is done for budget reasons, but it is still causes great harm. We're pleased the winter does not include these criteria, as which are at present, recognizing the dangers of living outside in extreme weather. We would point out that increasingly these conditions exist in the summer as well, and that the intolerable heat can create very life-threatening situations for many people who have underlying health conditions, but who may fall outside the scope of the eligibility parameters. We're disappointed the bill continues to limit the number of days during the non-winter months. Again, we believe this is probably for budget reasons only, but it really is fairly arbitrary. I would point out that no limits exist in the shelter program that we operate, as there's a recognition that a tight housing market and unaffordable rents are the reasons that a household is unhoused, and they're out of the control of any individual person or household. We support the requirement of participation in coordinated entry. It is our practice in the outreach program we now provide in the motels to enroll everyone in coordinated entry who wants to work with us with an assessment of the household characteristics and needs and care planning. That has helped a number of people come into our more permanent shelters. They're there permanently, but the ones that we operate, where there's a bit of higher standard than is needed, and it shows some efforts to comply with the requirements of understanding the needs of the individual. We would encourage further cooperation between economic services and the local service providers and provision of more information to guests using motels, such as written reports on the remaining days of eligibility, other information of value. And I can imagine additional cooperative meetings that were drawn into the coordinated entry process and the local COCs through ESD, which is providing this essential service. We applaud the rigorous monthly reporting as outlined in the bill, which is essential to measure progress and challenges in the program, but then it's going to call for actions that follow, and we would welcome those conversations. But here's some other thoughts that seem relevant to the broad goals outside in this proposed legislation. We obviously are in support of the GA Emergency Task Force recommendations that are included in this list. On March 15th, the number of households that are going to lose their eligibility as the winter season ends is quite scary. Vermont has no plan currently to expand a capacity to shelter these vulnerable Vermonters, and so extending this to June 30 and ensuring that that occurs. I know there's been support for that, and we want to see that through. The services provided to households receiving emergency housing and motels through the community outreach program funded by HOP grants needs to continue, as it provides an essential lifeline to those households to help them with housing navigation, access to essential records, facilitating connections to insurance and other health providers, emergency food, funding, and other services. Through this work, my good staffer, Chelsea, and the Haven team have helped 9 households over the last year achieve permanent housing, and we're really proud of that work, and it is really hard moving from motel into permanent housing, but we can do it with the right resources and the right people working. I also warn, though, as the COVID-era ERAP funds wind down this fiscal year, the services provided by that staff funded through this program need to replace through state-funded support through the HOP program. And so we would encourage expansion of HOP funds to meet the needs in the community that have been provided through ERAP. The problem hasn't gone away, it's just that the ERAP funds have gone away. And so we ask that that support be provided. Vermont's housing and homelessness crisis will take sustained long-term investments to fully solve, and actions that will increase the supply of affordable housing are essential to reducing the number of people who are unhoused. I think that's enough now as our time is winding down, but I'm happy to answer any other questions that you have, and I'll provide my testimony to the committee.
Thank you, Michael. I'll start off with a couple of what I think are quick questions. One of the things that we have heard about, we know that there are shelter standards that come out from the department, and even within those shelter standards, there's some there's flexibility, I guess I would say. I mean, different shelters have different expectations of their guests. And so one of the things that we didn't ask the previous 2 folks, but I'm interested in your thoughts about the ability or requirement in some cases of the guests to participate in the cost of their shelter. So, the bill right now requires, 30% contribution, which is similar to what permanent housing requests of people in affordable housing. Right. But we've had recommendations from the task force that say that should not be required. I'm just, we've heard that different shelters do different things.
Yeah, so ours is, a savings program. That's, we have, particularly in our permanent shelters, we have the opportunity to, know people. They get regular case management through our service coordinators, which are based in the shelter. And I also want to go back on where I disagreed with one of the previous speakers, that Chelsea, who I mentioned, is doing the service coordination or the housing navigation out in the motel. She's also doing the coordinated entry with people. She's the one they know. And so that relationship, particularly there, which is kind of fragmented out in the motels where people coming and going all the time, I think that works better, at least for us. In the our regular shelters, we do have some staff who are dedicated to the coordinated entry management, but other team members play a part in it. But I much prefer a model which encourages savings, working with local banks to help establish savings programs that people can have access to. So access to banking is important as well. And rather than the contribution of people that are, it's hard enough to get some people to focus on the responsibility of what's going to take to find permanent housing, and we prefer our approach than the cost participation that is in place now. And I wonder how much it yields. Again, it's a budget mechanism, so perhaps it helps in the larger goals of the program, but as far as the individual, I find it maybe not as helpful as what the practice that we use.
Thank you. Other questions for this witness? It looks like you've covered the landscape, Michael.
Well, yeah, so appreciate the opportunity. Again, I like there's so many different approaches. The new waiver program under Medicaid, I think, has some possibilities. We'll see how that expands. It's a bit challenging though, since it currently doesn't come with any rent subsidies or any housing. So it's only the case management side, which is useful. But it then is limited to 12 people at a time. It's a flexible environment. And so we're wondering how that exactly is going to work. The caseload's great, they've managed the 12, but there's a lot of movement inside of the population we work with, and the dedication to stick with something over time. I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of ins and outs in that program, and perhaps that makes a difference in the funding side of it and sustainability. But it's a well-funded program the way it's been described. So I applaud that, and I like the idea. And we do, we use the Medicaid waiver for the family supportive housing already, but there people are more likely already in housing. So it truly is the support side. But there's good to experiment, and I think that's where we start.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Okay, folks, we're going to take a brief break here for about the next 12 minutes or so. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. And if you could send along your comments, that would be wonderful.
Will do. Thank you.
And